All right.
Get out of the stream, will you? I'm going to do my little presentation and tell everybody about what's going on with NATO and what happened. All of the allies met yesterday in Germany, in Ramstein in Germany. So this is something that happens once a month. They've been doing them via Zoom meetings, but yesterday everybody met up in the meeting. You can see there. And before that, Stoltenberg, the boss of NATO, actually went to Kyiv for the first time, and he went and met his little mate Zelensky over there, which was, was it good, bad, indifferent? So one of the things that I wanted to highlight here, folks, and why it's such an important thing here. But before I talk about why that was such an important meeting, I just want to play a little video from Mark Milley, who's the boss of the military in the US. And Mark Milley was talking about what we are going to do to continue to support them. So let's play that video.
Since the early phases of this war, and for every month since, the United States has provided Ukraine with the capabilities to defend itself. And in conjunction with our allies and partners, we have delivered. This coalition will continue to provide vital training and additional capabilities for air defense and maneuver to enable Ukraine's ongoing fight. Air defense munitions, air defense capabilities, tank munitions, armored vehicle capabilities, artillery ammunition, artillery tubes and rockets, and spare parts remain critical as Ukraine protects its cities and expels the Russian menace from its territory. Our countries and the countries of Europe have pledged that Ukraine will have the capabilities it needs to execute their missions on their own timeline. And we have pledged that support for as long as it takes, as the Secretary just said. This week, the United States announced our latest security assistance package as part of our ongoing commitment to Ukraine. As we stand here today, the Ukrainian military continues to perform very well. Intense fighting in and around Bakhmut continues and has for several months. Russia is expending significant manpower for very little gain. Russia is intensifying indiscriminate shelling in Avdiivka and other cities and urban areas. And Russia continues to pay severely for its war of choice.
All right, folks, that's pretty much it. He didn't really say anything new or anything that you would expect. Everyone was expecting an announcement around fighter jets and fighter aircraft and whatnot, but that hasn't come yet. Although there seemed to be a little bit of a slip of the tongue from Jens Stoltenberg, who mentioned that we continue to provide ammunition, tanks, etc., and he said jets in there as well. But they haven't supplied any jets yet. They supplied, some of the other European countries have supplied their old hardware, the Polish MiG-29s. There's some other MiG-29s from some other countries that came across as well, but NATO hasn't supplied any jets. So one of the things that I wanted to kind of shine a light on, and part of the reason that this appointment and this meeting was so important, is because for a while now, the Ukraine has said that they want to be part of NATO, and NATO has pushed back on that and said, there's no chance that you're going to be part of NATO while there's a war going on. However, they've said that by June or July of this year, that NATO will provide a security guarantee to the Ukrainians. So in my view, that represents an existential threat to the Russians. And that's probably one of the biggest announcements that's not been spoken about. And the reason that it's not been spoken about is, for some reason, the journalists out there can't seem to join all of the dots as to why that's such a dangerous thing. And so let me try and join the dots for everybody out there. The Russians will only use nuclear weapons when there's an existential threat to their country, meaning if their organization and their federation is threatened by an external force, they then have the right to use nuclear weapons in a first strike. So if NATO have come out and said, you're not going to have a buffer zone between Poland and your border, meaning Ukraine, that's not your buffer zone, we're going to fold them into NATO and we're going to go right up against your border, that represents an existential threat to them. The whole reason that the Russians invaded was because of that, to turn Ukraine into a giant buffer zone to stop any more encroachment into their territory. And not that that was happening, but they didn't want any, they wanted a buffer zone from NATO. And now that NATO has come out and said, we're going to support you for as long as it takes, we're going to give you whatever you need for as long as it takes, it'll be on your timelines, I suspect that the counterattack won't go as well as what everybody thinks, because the Russians will just absorb it all, and then they'll just put more manpower on the front line, and we'll be right back to where we are today. After the Ukrainian blood has been spilt, the treasury is gone, and all of the equipment has been destroyed. So I'm really worried about that, because what that then means is the Ukrainians throw up their hands and go, well, we're trying to do everything. They've got to get out of our country. They've got to leave. And then it's at that point NATO said, well, we said we're going to provide a security guarantee. Here comes our Air Force. And then as soon as the Air Force comes in there, the Russians are like, hey, that represents an existential threat to us. Just you saying that to us is a threat. Even if the Russians don't have the capability to fight back against the NATO air forces or to fight back against NATO ground troops that went into Ukraine, what they will do is they will strike those NATO bases on their territory, not in Ukraine. But the only way that they'll do it is with ballistic missiles that rain down from space with nuclear warheads on them. They'll fire one Sarmat missile from the middle of Russia. It'll deploy 50 warheads and hit every single military base in Europe in one go. One missile will destroy the whole of the NATO infrastructure in one foul swoop. So I'm really concerned about this because the allies come out and say, we're going to support you for as long as it takes. You'll get everything that you need, and we will help you for as long as it takes. And that, in my view, represents an existential threat to Russia. And they haven't been so strong in their language. And Stoltenberg, in his speech that he gave with Zelensky in Kyiv, said that they've so far supplied more than $150 billion worth of hardware, which is an incredible amount of equipment and manpower and people. And they've trained literally tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. They've trained people on Patriot batteries to drive tanks, to be infantry soldiers, and a myriad of other things. And in my view, that is a really, really scary proposition. There's a lot that's happening there, but there's also a lot not being said about it because people just don't understand how the Russian doctrine works. And when you look at the way that the Russians are behaving, their doctrine is the way they're behaving is exactly according to their doctrine. The way that they dig in, the way that they operate, the way that they expend troops, the way that they leave every man that's killed on the battlefield behind. We have the opposite, right? We leave no man or woman behind on the battlefield. But these Russian soldiers are killed at scale, and they're all just left dead on the battlefield. No one cares about them or anything like that. And they just keep throwing them into the meat grinder. And even Mark Milley just said now in that quick video that they're suffering huge casualties, and their capacity and ability to outsuffer us is far greater than our capacity to inflict damage on them. They're not going to stop because they lose 2,000 troops in one day. Imagine if we lost 2,000 troops in one day. There's just no way the support at home would stand for that. But that's happening on a weekly basis. There's 2,000 odd Ukrainians being killed every day. How many troops do they have on the front line? When I think of the Australian Army, and how many frontline battalions do we have? Infantry guys like me, not many. It's half a dozen or something like that. So if there's 6,000 to 10,000 Australian infantry guys out there like me, all ready and willing to get into the fight and to hook in and go for it, but the Russians on the other side would destroy all of that in a matter of a couple of weeks, then where would Australia be? We would be toast. And that's what I'm saying. My concern is that NATO come out and say there's a security guarantee. The Ukrainians are going to get rolled up eventually unless the counterattack actually works. And, I'll close out by saying that I've never wanted to be more wrong in my life. I never want to tell somebody else that they're wrong, but I also don't want to be wrong when I say things out loud. I want to say correct information. I don't want to give you misinformation or disinformation. And I'm not some sort of Russia bro saying the Russians are going to win. I'm on their side. We're on the wrong side of history. Any of that rubbish. What I'm saying to you is that if you look at Russian doctrine, and I've looked at it, I've got a book on my shelf there behind me, and I've studied it, and I've looked at it, and you look at the way that they behave on the battlefield, and I can do that from 10,000 miles away on the other side of planet Earth, and I can do that from a 100,000-foot view of a battlefield as a pundit and a wannabe pundit to make that happen. And they're following their doctrine to the letter. One of the things that concerns me as well is there's a lot of Russian shipping activity in and around the North Sea. So you went away and destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline. I raise you. Yeah, I raise you. And what you're going to see is a series of hybrid warfare attacks that have plausible deniability. So these Russian ships are tracking around the North Sea, and there's all the software and tracking tools that you can see via AIS and where they are, what they're doing, and what's happening. And there's a lot of open source intelligence out there about that. But if they go away and cut off some of the internet cables, they cut off some of the power to the UK and to the EU, you're never going to know about it. And hybrid warfare like that is part of their doctrine. Remember, they're going to escalate to de-escalate, and the order of battle that they actually have is space cyber, then EMP, and now we go to air, sea, and land warfare. So we're still in the opening phases of this war, even though it's a year on, and we might start to see this cyber attack stuff happening, and then we'll see space happening. Remember, in the exercises that we do with NATO as us playing the Russian side, when we follow their doctrine, it always ends up in a nuclear war.
Yep.
But before we get there, we'll take out all the satellite-based assets and start cyber and hybrid warfare, which will turn everything off in the first week of the war. So if this gets really serious really quickly, and this NATO security guarantee is seen as an existential threat, that's the next level of this conflict. It comes outside of the borders of Ukraine. And we've already done that. We did that with Nord Stream, and that might happen in the North Sea to the Europeans as well. What do you think, Ed? It's a pretty scary time in history, man.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I want your opinion on two questions for you. So I think it's generally considered that America didn't lose the war in Vietnam militarily. It was a political loss. The public opinion at home shifted. It was so anti-war. It got to a point where America made a political decision to pull out. It wasn't a military loss. It was a political loss. Would you agree with that statement, or?
It was lost by the politicians, not lost by the soldiers. But what they did, so it's the culture that they set there. So I'd be happy to be corrected here, but of all the books that I've read and all the research that I've done a lot of that, because that was the war that I studied the most when I was a kid, right? Because that was the most recent thing as a kid growing up in the 1980s. And what I know about it is the politicians set the frame to tell the soldiers on the ground, what you need to do is to count all the dead Vietnamese soldiers. And the reason we want to do that is because it's a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, we need to know how many of them we've destroyed versus how many we've got left. And the American soldiers on the ground would count what they thought was happening, but there was no way to get accurate information. And sometimes things were embellished. Sometimes they were undercounted.
Okay, well, that's a tactical thing. And you're right. I agree with I agree with that. But at the end there, the decision to pull out, it was a political decision because public opinion had turned so much against the war by them. That's why they pulled. They didn't pull out because the North Vietnamese had just won a big battle and we had to get out. Okay,
well, you can't keep showing on Walter Cronkite at 6 o'clock at night dead American soldiers and guys getting rolled up by enemy troops. You can't show that and think that public opinion is going to be in your favor.
Right.
The one thing that we do wrong in Western society with modern warfare is we don't show actually what's going on. If you just go over to Telegram, and I know you're new to Telegram, Ed, I'm going to start posting some of the things about the war in our new Telegram channel. And folks, make sure you follow us in Telegram. The link's in the description below, because if something ever happens here on YouTube, all of the content will be over there. But I'll start posting some real-time war footage in there, and you will see that your support for the war will go away quick smart, especially when you see war crimes being committed on a daily basis.
Well, okay. Well, just as we had the media back then against the war and putting the appropriate images on TV, the media today, they're supporting the administration, and so you're getting a lack of those kind of images, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, apparently there are many protests starting to pop up around the world, mostly in Europe, in Germany and France, that are anti-war, and these are NATO countries. So what do you think the chances are that NATO will start losing its appetite because of growing public disdain against this war? Do you think that could happen?
Yes, I absolutely think that could happen. And I think Putin knows that. And Putin's not going anywhere because it's his backyard. And neither are those Europeans, but the Europeans are being threatened by Putin. At some point, they're going to have to negotiate. Every conflict in human history has either ended with the enemy completely rolling you up and occupying you, or at negotiation. And I think it's a bit of a bridge too far to say that the Russians are going to be able to roll up and occupy Europe the way that the Soviets did after World War II. I think that's kind of a bridge too far.
Well, okay, so if you're Putin and you're seeing the protests starting to grow, wouldn't you be just prolonging it as much? Because the longer you wait, the more the citizens are going to do, in Western Europe, are going to do the work for you.
If I channel my inner Putin, I see you and I raise you. And that's what they do. They escalate to de-escalate. Yeah. We've seen them do that in several ways. And that's where I say this is going to start spilling over outside the borders of Europe, and it'll spill over into the oceans. Yeah, and you'll see the cyber attacks, and they could easily shut down our satellite systems, our GPS systems, and a series of other things that we've got in space, our space-based assets, they've demonstrated their ability to fire a missile from the ground to shoot down satellites. And it causes all sorts of havoc in space. And they don't care what happens as a result of that. All they care about is taking our eyes and ears away. And the vast majority of what we do from a targeting perspective is based on space-based assets. And the guy I was talking to yesterday about prepping and about nuclear war survival and what to do, he said, "Oh, do you think we'd ever be a target?" And I said, "Mate, any city on planet Earth that has an international airport has got at least 5 or 6 hydrogen bombs pointed at it right now." And he was like, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, man. If the shizzy hits the fizzy, as the saying goes, the enemy will take out Pine Gap in the middle of Australia. They'll take out Canberra, our political centres, centres of gravity. They'll take out Sydney Airport, Katoomba, Richmond, Williamtown, Tyndall, Amberley. All of those places will go. And Australia, when you look at the cities and the confinement of the cities, they're not very big places. And an airburst nuke that went off at 20,000 feet would annihilate all of those cities. But the target is not the cities. The target is the military installations. And they take those military installations off the table. And people don't understand that in order for the Russians to succeed, if you look at the rhetoric of what they say a world without Russia is not a world worth having. And they continuously have this nuclear rhetoric saying, we've got bigger and better weapons and we will destroy you all.
Oh, yeah. Putin mentions it every other day. He's mentioning his nuclear weapons. Where in America, we have a policy. It's a no-no to mention nuclear, right?
And that's the doctrine, right? Because a nuclear war should never be fought because it can never be won. That's why you guys never say that. But the reality is it's not just the Americans with nuclear weapons. And a lot of people forget that and don't talk about it. Israelis have got it. The French have got it. The Indians, the Pakistanis. There's a series of countries, the Brits as well, that have it. So the Russians seem to think that the nuclear war is just going to be with the Americans. And that's what the rhetoric is always there. But it's not. It's a combined force. But then I also think those turncoats, the French, are they actually going to back us? I don't know. They couldn't sort themselves out in World War One. They needed help in World War Two.
Flip of the coin.
I don't know.
Okay, and my last question is, okay, so the stated objective by all of our politicians who are in favor of this war, as well as Zelensky himself, is regime change in Russia. They say that's what they want. They want regime change in Russia. And that's why we're supporting Ukraine, because we want regime change in Russia. So they want Putin gone. So,
well, if Putin's
gone, and you and I have talked about this before, but I wanted to get this on camera for the folks. So if Putin's gone, who takes his space? Who takes his place, and to what effect?
Yeah, Dmitry Medvedev steps up into that because he was the only other president of Russia since Putin's been around since the year 2000 because of the way their rules work. And then they changed the constitution so he could have an infinite term, be a leader for life, like Xi Jinping, so to speak. But
so in other words, democracy isn't going to break out if we get rid of Putin.
Well, there's a bunch of breakaway republics inside of the Russian Federation that don't like Putin. And they don't like being governed. They want to be their own countries. But the reality is that's not going to happen. And that's what I'm saying to you is the Russian rhetoric, especially from Medvedev, who would take over, who would be Putin's successor if something happened to Putin, if he died of natural causes or he was killed, then he would take over. He's on the record saying that there's no world without Russia in it. And without Russia in it, there is no world. So his rhetoric is really inflammatory, and he's far more hawkish than what Putin is. Putin is some person that always tries to continuously use history to teach everybody a lesson, but Medvedev just says, we've got nuclear weapons and we'll destroy you, stop it. And that's a big stick that he waves at everybody all the time, and everyone knows in NATO, they're like, whoa, we know that he can do that. We know that that potentially is going to be a problem for us, so we need to maybe dial back our rhetoric. And then but the reality is this tit-for-tat escalation doesn't lead anywhere. And what it does is it highlights and shows to me that war is a complete and total failure of humanity. And once again, I was thinking about what am I going to report on today, what I'm going to talk about. There's a series of things I want to talk about. But I'm like, I can't not talk about this because these are the biggest things that are happening in our society. And the thing that you raised is probably the second biggest thing that's happening in our society, the de-dollarization, of the USD going away, hyperinflation, all that money coming home to the US. These things affect us. and you don't realize, but they do. And the geopolitical nature of it might not be something that people are interested in talking about or understanding because it's too complicated. But ultimately, you go to the shops and you go and buy a bag of groceries, and suddenly you're $60 out of pocket. And I'm holding 2 bags of groceries, going, what? $60 for that? There's nothing in it. There's some apples and oranges and some dinner in there and a loaf of bread and a box of eggs. Like, really? That was $60? Well, the cost of living is just running away. Inflation is here, and is that because of the war in Ukraine? Is that because of what's going on in geopolitically? No, it's got to do with the complete and total incompetence of our reserve bank system and the politicians that actually run and govern it. It does affect you. This stuff does affect you on a day-to-day basis.